catch it on Spotify. We're going to hit record in 3, 2. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. As you know, this podcast is for people who are looking to take care of their financial legacy. And for that to happen, I think you have to understand the economy and maybe where to invest, which countries are doing really well, which countries are focusing on growing and developing. Because if you can understand that, you can maybe position yourself to win. And the book that we're talking about today is called Gambling on Development. I love the title of that book, Why Some Countries Win and Others Lose. It is an honor to have the author here, Stefan Durkheim. Thanks so much for being here, sir.
Well, I'm very glad to be with you.
Well, I saw the title and it seems like you're a marketer at heart, gambling on development. It kind of makes sense for the content of the book all the way through because those who are in development mode win no matter what, right? And so I think of countries like China in the early 80s. I just had a guest earlier today on this podcast that said, I drove a motorcycle around the world, and while I was in China, I just knew China right then and there was going to be the number one producer on a long enough timeline. And so he was able to see it long time ago when everybody else thought he was insane. And so maybe you were able to evaluate other countries, whether it is places like I think I was looking at so Bangladesh, Ghana, Ethiopia. Why did you write this book, and what did you see out there that really said, you know what, this message needs to be heard from the world?
Well, it probably helps to just know a little bit about me. I'm an academic, and we sit in the ivory tower. We like to. This is my office building behind me on screen,
Oh, that's
and
nice.
it's and it's the kind of thing, you sit there, you write as an academic, but actually about 12, 13 years ago, I had the chance to actually work in essentially an agency that was going to work, and I was a chief economist working on countries that were extremely poor or maybe began to emerge. And for me, the thing was that as a researcher, I had looked a lot at Africa. And if you go back a couple of decades, and most people's image of Africa is poverty, is chaos, is conflict, is hunger. It's actually quite a dire picture. And I must say, when I started a long time ago as an academic, you had a feeling, you kept on hoping, look, this one day will change, but it wasn't quite happening. And I remember that actually ended up in India and actually ended up in Bangalore in the early 1990s. And what was really fascinating, if you think of Bangalore in India, this is the place where all the tech is now, where all the booming sectors are in India. But
Yeah.
this was the early 90s. They had only just started, I learned later on. But you could feel already, okay, this is a place where actually change is beginning to happen. So India in the early 1990s started feeling like, wow, this is something going to happen. Just as your other person had it in China, I had it a bit later in 90s. Yeah, this is beginning to happen. And so for me, over the years, then, when I was working in this last 15 years or so, intensively more on the policy side, I was kind of asking, okay, why is it that if I travel in Africa and in Ghana, I begin to have that feeling, in Ethiopia, I have that feeling that things are changing, and I go to Nigeria, I see a lot of dynamism, and I still don't think anything will happen. I go to Congo and nothing is going to happen. And it's a bit like, can I get okay, I'm a researcher. I know the evidence. I know the growth rates. I know the economic policies. I know the successes and failures in the numbers. But what is it that actually you kind of need to understand about, well, what's behind it? What's behind it? And that's what I wanted to write a book about. Why Indonesia? Why Bangladesh? Why India? And why not Pakistan? And why not Nigeria? And why I was just in South Africa last week again. Why is it stagnating there? What's going on there that the others have it? What's the magic potion that they seem to have? And probably importantly, for anyone listening and knows a little bit about these places, if I mention like a Ghana or an Ethiopia, maybe many people don't know, but they've heard of India. They may have been in India. They may have been spending time. You may have spent time in China. China and India are totally different, but still they have something of this magic potion. And then you wanted to actually ask us, I want to ask yourself, can I bring it back to some of the essentials in the book and communicate a bit like, what is it really about these places that seem to have at some point begin to gamble on progress, on growth and development, and why the others haven't quite done this?
I would assume you came across some really clear answers, but I would think that maybe some of the ones that would stand out in my mind would be the culture, right? I know that America was able to thrive because there was a culture of rebellion and capitalism, but also resources. If your country has certain resources, you can have a competitive advantage. So those are the two that stand out. Am I wrong about saying that those are the leading factors, or is there something else?
No, you're not wrong. I wouldn't say is it the leading factor in itself. So one of the things for those of us that are more scholars of kind of growth processes, a very famous one, Robert Solow, he actually passed away in the last year. And Robert Solow famously was asked, what is it about Bangladesh that actually, how can they grow faster? What is it about it? And he has said, as a scholar, spending his entire life studying all these different places, he said, look, we know the ingredients, but we don't know the recipe. There is not a kind of the single recipe of it. So you mentioned, you have to have the resources, but I can go to Nigeria. They have, billions and billions of oil. That's a resource that could actually be used to invest and build your economy, and still nothing is happening. Indonesia, Indonesia actually in the early 1990s looked almost identical to in terms of resources, in terms of oil capacity and the structure of the economy as Nigeria. And Indonesia, it started to happen. And so you kind of have to understand a bit. And for me, the important is you could say, oh, it's the rebellious mind or whatever, but what is it that at some point unleashes it? What makes it special about 1979 in China when the change started to happen? The same party is in power even up to now. Why was it for 40 years nothing happened and then happened? Why in India? You had more or less the same political systems going back since independence. So, and since the 1950s, it had been going a particular way. Why did they change in 1991? And that's for me the more interesting question. And for me, it comes down to there are people that have the power and the influence in society to make change possible. And I will be clear in a moment. But I call this like the people of power and influence. And if these people are not aligned with progress in growth and development, nothing may happen.
Mm-hmm.
If they are aligned, and actually it's beginning to then actually things can happen. And who are these people? Often we say, oh, it's the politician. We know well enough. It's not just politicians who determine anything or everything. They play a role. They can stop it. They can also allow the conditions can happen. But it's also people in the business community. It's people in the military. It's people in the senior civil service, in the public administration. It's journalists, media people, maybe you, Mike, all the people who talk about these things. You are actually people potentially with power and influence. And it's thinking what brings them together when it comes to issues to do with growth and development. What is in the underlying fabric, the things that links them? And culture is too easy because that's historical. And China had the same culture in the 1960s than in the 1980s, and things actually changed. It's to do with agency and the actions of behavior of these people. So I call this in my book, these are the people in the elite. And it's very helpful when you look at a state and a location. What is it that all these people with power and influence, what ties them together? What is lots of things? Of course, it could be making money, but you could make money by taking it away from others and just trying to get power and stealing from the rest. Or you could say, we're actually going to actually kind of co-invest, almost have an implicit commitment that growth and development are the right things to pursue. And once you get somehow that kind of fabric coming together, that kind of deal between important influential groups to happen, change can begin to happen. And why do I talk about these people with power and influence? Is because it's really important to understand these people can stop it. They can actually, if in Nigeria, there is a lot of oil, and they decide the only thing we're going to care about is how we actually divide up the oil amongst a small group of people, and the rest doesn't matter.
Oh,
Well, you get stagnation. That's the status quo. You can be an entrepreneur there, but how can you break through that? They set up the state, society, the structure of the economies, the legal system, all pointed to as long as you serve us, it's fine, and there is no chance of doing it. And so the successful countries somehow or another found a moment when they could unleash that potential because they somehow, those people who could stop it didn't stop it anymore, and hopefully also begin to help it and to move it forward.
wow. So there is a moment that maybe corruption breaks free in some of these countries. and therefore many people can become wealthy and profit from the resources rather than just a few. So you brought up
Exactly.
China, 1979. Can you go back to that and kind of maybe give
Yeah.
us some insight on what
Yeah.
did happen there?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because, we can look at China in the 1980s, 90s, all the way up to now. There's plenty of corruption. You said the corruption word there.
Yeah, right.
Corruption is actually, funny enough, is a symptom. Corruption can manifest itself in all kinds of different contexts. And in some cases, it totally goes against progress in growth and development. And sometimes, actually, it can be, well, not helping. I would never say it greases the wheels and it should be there, but somehow it doesn't stop enough. So if I go back to 1979 in China, it's really interesting because, you go back all the way to Mao, of course, before it. And Mao had died um, after a period in the 1960s and early 1970s of the Cultural Revolution, where basically said we're going to do everything we do has to be based on dogma. The little red book of Mao, it was everything is dogma.
Yeah.
So everything is around dogmatic. So you run the economy and society all based on dogma. Now, I know enough about economics that doesn't usually go over very well if you do dogma. And in fact, China was stagnating dramatically. And it was also, but it was strongly in control. The party was in control and so on. Now Mao dies, and actually the Cultural Revolution had actually disrupted a lot of society as well. And then there was a power struggle after he had died. I think it was 1976 he died. And then there was a power struggle, the Gang of Four, we used to call it. It was the widow of Mao and so on. They wanted to continue that. And then there were people in the party who they didn't really, that was not about let's democratize the country and let's open it up. No, this is all about how can we keep in power. And people like Deng Xiaoping was actually more or less finding a way to get a coalition around him that actually says, look, if we want to survive as a party, we'll have to actually deliver on growth and food security for the people. And we need to get a system going that actually is consistent with growth and food security. And food security mattered a lot because people had died so much in famines in the 1960s, and then growth, to get the means. This was not about suddenly recognizing, oh, America has won the battle, we need to follow them. No, this was all about their survival, looking for their way of growing the economy, and in fact, making everything in the system internally accountable to progress in growth. And if they didn't do, they were punished and they were pushed and so on. So often people talk about this was not a period of economic reform, but actually of governance reform, the way we govern it. You get rewarded for progress in growth and food security. Now, that actually means that people in power are entirely going to be focused on, wow, we need to deliver growth here. And everything is there. This is not anymore just lining my pockets. No, I better deliver growth. If I line my pockets a bit, that's a sideshow. But fundamentally, it's about growth. And so you get a very different setup than the United States that, of course, did this earlier. But you get a very different setup. But actually, the incentives are the same. It's again the elites, the people with power, want to set up a system that can, at least in these early stages of development, deliver a lot of growth and progress, and of course opportunities for investors and all the things that we were talking about.
Now you talk about how there's people have these shifts, right? These are individuals who take the helm and just move the country in a different direction, unleashing its total power and capability. I think that happened in the United States right around the 40s and 50s, and maybe a little bit in the 80s. But since then, I think America has let the foot off the gas. How are you noticing? Were you able to kind of evaluate and see how, yeah, maybe there's so much development or growth in one country that they become too comfortable, and then
Yes.
that allows for other countries to catch up. Now, America is not losing, but it's starting to fall apart, I guess. So it will eventually lose to China, and I think that's becoming the manufacturing company of the country of the world. So have you noticed that this is just a common trend that once countries develop to such a high degree, it's only a matter of time before they become the Roman Empire, if you will?
Yes. No, Mike, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting you put it in the 40s and the 50s. I usually would say the moment that the elite deals changed was probably the New Deal, Roosevelt's new deal.
Yeah.
And it actually, in a sense, was the first time that the state said, look, we have a responsibility to keep this going, and it needs to be more inclusive. It needs to be more inclusive of the population. Otherwise, it won't work.
That was the
And
early 30s, right? The New Deal.
yeah,
Yep.
Exactly, the beginning of the, and then of course it saw its effects in the 1940s and
Yep.
50s,
Got it.
where actually then the society there. And because if you think of it, before that, a lot of American politics, it was a lot to do with, the state has no role in the economy, not even trying to set the foundations of the economy. So it's not about state intervention or not, but simply saying we have a role here. And we, as powerful players in this case in politics, we need to make sure that we can facilitate this progress, and in this case also that we make it inclusive enough. Now, it's an interesting thing that you say, because I actually totally agree with you. When you look across the world here, okay, and you get in lots of places, think of China here actually at this very moment. If you look also at India, I could look at Bangladesh and so on, and we may not have the time to dig it deeper, but all these countries, they go through a phase of a couple of decades of this kind of progress. But then, of course, growth and development creates new elite groups, very powerful groups that have a
Hmm.
control, and they're very comfortable with the way it is.
Yeah.
That could be elites in politics. It could be elites in the way politics is financed. It could be a way of what it is. It could be the financial, it could be Wall Street and not really delivering for people. It's a different sector that delivers a lot of money. Somehow or another, a new elite emerges. And so one of the things that's very striking. So when I wrote this book, I don't have a single chapter, for example, about Latin America. Actually, in Latin America, they recognized it entirely, because there's a lot of these societies that had early pushes and then got stuck. And actually, for decades now already, Latin America is in a bit of in a rut. You see it also with the flows of migrants coming into America, because the opportunities, they fizzled out in Latin America. And it's a lot to do with an elite that got comfortable and actually not saying, by the way, we need to open up this elite deal again. We need to have new generation of entrepreneurs to be part of this. We can't just control the whole thing. We need to actually allow it. The same is happening actually in China, that the system is actually getting under President Xi, actually getting stuck. The guy is totally obsessed with internal control. We see it in the geopolitics, but actually the international politics entirely follows from a fear of the party again losing control and strengthening the control. The economy is not functioning as well anymore, and looking for a new model. And I simply say, I don't know where the magic will come from, whether it's in the US or whether it's in China, but somehow or another, these elite deals need to be renewed. You need to have a new way of getting somehow a broader consensus in society. And if you think what's happening in elections there, it's like neither presidential candidate attracts a lot of support in many ways, in a deep sense, and let's not go too deep into the politics, but populism is ultimately not really an answer, is a disruption. It's not creating the New Deal, and we see that in Latin America with Bolsonaro. We saw that in other places. You know, it's often a last sign and saying, look, we need to have a new sense. And if you look at the US, I'm tempted to say, if we go back, why do we have the New Deal in the 1930s? It has a lot to do with the kind of elite structures that emerged from the robber barons before that, very powerful key people and another way of setting up the economy. Of course, the current generation of robber barons have a different face, that's from tech, it's from hedge funds and whatever. But somehow or another, they try very hard to keep the status quo there. And actually, yeah, you lose the dynamism, and it's not obvious what the alternative would be, but it is there. And you see it all over the world, these phases of new understanding has to happen, not least of course, amongst ordinary people as well, but also amongst the elite, because again, they have blocking power. They have the power of the status quo, and that's their main power. They don't have ideas necessarily, but they like the status quo.
Now, when it comes to countries who lose, I would assume there are many breadcrumbs to those too, and just ones that come to mind as number one, certain leaders, but number two, you're talking about regulations. Number three, maybe a focus on entrepreneurship and capitalism is bad. So there's a culture shift of saying anybody who's trying to create wealth is actually the enemy. And so
Yeah.
I would think that there's a few there that stand out. What did you find out in your research?
Look, in the kind of, I wrote mainly on the countries, or exclusively on countries that kind of new. And of course there are examples all over the world in various ways. But let me go back to this idea of these elite deals, the elite bargains, as I call it in the book. There's the kind of the deals that exist. You know, you do get these societies, like the most extreme ones would be, you know, maybe Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where historically, you know, if you get access to the state, you get license to steal. And it's basically these are
I would
kleptocracies.
assume so from what I've
Yeah.
heard from that place.
Yes. And like Venezuela has these features as well. If you control the state, you just steal.
Yes.
And of course, for a while this can work, but then after a bit, that just implodes. And you know, these are the kind of countries that rather than growing their economy, they actually are shrinking their economy. So the Democratic Republic of Congo is now a third smaller in per capita terms, per person terms of their economy than they were at independence. So they actually over since independence in 1960s, they've been shrinking. And the pie has been shrinking. And of course, once the pie is shrinking, the incentive is to even more do zero-sum games, you know? I'm going to grab it, otherwise you can grab it. And so you come across quite a few of these. I can think in, you know, you get Myanmar. Actually, you get Pakistan is a country that I look at, where I really worry about, where it's all become zero sum, where actually it's stagnation, totally staying behind relative to India. You know, and if I'm an investor, yeah, you may have some opportunities, but you just don't see a long-term future in these places. You know, it's actually pretty stagnant at the moment. And so you get these places where the underlying elite bargain is essentially about grabbing what you can. You know, to give an example, Nigeria, the current president, he was actually meant to be, they call him a godfather. And godfather, actually, the people who used to buy politics, who basically would finance the elections of other people and then would all get the support. He had dabbled in politics. He had been a governor of Lagos before, of the financial hub. And, you know, arguably he did reasonably well. But he becomes the leading candidate for the leading party. And what slogan will he use? Oh, very plainly, it's my turn. That's his slogan for winning an election. And it's
That
basically
was his political message.
official election campaign slogan.
That's
Now,
unbelievable. That's putting
it's
it
my
out
turn.
there.
Yeah. And so you get the sense, look, this is not serious. This is about, I'm going to grab power. I'm going to decide who gets the rents from the oil here, and I'll do the things. And you don't feel it serious. It's all about. And in fact, typically they say in Nigeria, if you want to become president, you know, this is a country with a GDP per capita below $2,000 per person. If you want to be president, you probably need to find about $3 to $4 billion in promises you need to make, that once you're done president, you need to then actually pay it out. And your first term, they call it the time of reimbursement. So you become you appoint ministers that you need to reimburse. Okay, these are the kind of places say, look, fundamentally, all these elite incentives, they're just wrong. And potentially a place like that is lots of entrepreneurship. Can you get somehow to a situation that at least they start saying, let's not necessarily impoverish ourselves, but let's focus on growing the pie here and do the right things. And that's these moments in time. And by the way, you said individual leaders. Sometimes you don't know who the actual leader was of it. Sometimes it's more decentralized. Multiple people in powerful positions in business, in politics, in civil service, in media, that actually realize, oh my God, this needs to be different. And slowly create credibility of different ways of different way of doing politics by acting in a different way, you know, by being kind of, or actually showing like a business person saying, look, I think I'm actually going to invest in the long run. Or you can do something extreme. That's happened in Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. You know, Singapore, massive growth, enormous potential. Still, it's the fastest growing economy over long periods of time since the 1960s. So Lee Kuan Yew was the leader that came to power from a party that usually also would buy elections and would have lots of party finance and a lot of corruption and so on. So he needed to signal that he actually wanted to put growth central and clean government central, and not anymore the way they were doing politics before. So he did one thing. He did arguably what a lot of leaders, when they come in power, are going to do. He said, I'm going to fight corruption. And usually it means you're going to arrest a few of your political opponents and you're going to accuse them of corruption. And
Yeah. Do accuse them of what you're doing, period.
exactly. Anyway, what he did, he jailed the main person, the business leader that had financed his election. And he said he put him in jail for corruption. Now, if you want to give a signal that I'm going to win an election in the future in another way, that's what you do. You jail the people that paid for your election. And I think, and he could credibly signal as a result that, look, I'm going to do this different. And that's the hardest thing. Can you find in these different places, if you want to do it differently, how do you signal that? And of course, that's a powerful signal. I'm not saying everywhere in the world we should jail the people that pay for our election. It would be quite interesting in the US, isn't it?
Whoa. Yeah, there would be a few that we know of
Yes.
that are big names, of course.
But it's about signaling and finding ways, and sometimes it's individuals doing particular actions, sometimes it's broader groups of people. But yeah, look, and by the way, with all the things I say, I'm an enormous optimist about it, because in the last 3, 4 decades, we've seen massive amount of growth in emerging economies and in developing countries, some of the poorest places. So I was working for a long time in Ethiopia, one of the poorest places on earth, when I started working there in the early 90s. In the period 2010 to 2020, it was the fastest growing economy in the world. And they actually managed to find a window. Yes, it's at the moment quite unstuck, and there's a conflictual situation, but there are these ups and downs, and it shows that some of these places can suddenly begin to unleash. You know, their GDP is now about 4 or 5 times what it was in the 1990s. So there's this massive growth that they managed to unleash. So there are these moments, and it makes me optimistic, because suddenly there's this change in front of you. I say, oh, wow, this can happen. And then, yeah, and then if I'm an investor, I keep an eye on these places and say, look, I'll better be part of this game, you know, and this is the places. Because if you do it in a place that is stagnant or where everything is a zero-sum game, you will only make money at the cost of at the expense of someone else. And it's really hard then. But if you can take the growth wave, well, then you're actually in for it. And all these places need investment. And it's, you know, try to understand how how it fits together. It's not about one minister, one president, but somehow or another is the local business community clearly now focusing on growth and not just corruption or rent seeking. And are we getting that? And these are the places where I would put my money if I had any.
Yeah, and I guess that you were able to see some type of common trend that the places that were growing had a few things in common when it comes to safety, whether it's for a population or for individuals to invest in. And so when I think of just the United States, Nashville, for example, exploded with population because it was a clean city. There was a lot of opportunity, but it was safe. Everybody knew that was a place to go if you wanted to have a safe area. Whether it is now or not, I don't know, but it was a small enough area. It was safe. It was clean, and it drew a lot of people to that area. So that also, if people go, businesses follow. So it just makes so much sense that businesses will go and invest in places that they know is a safe area, but is a constant growth for population. And
Yeah.
so I look at Florida, for example, because of 2020, it exploded, which if I was a business investing in a state, I'm picking Florida, right? And so if you were out there and you were preaching to maybe a government, what would you say in order to, have a growing, country? Would you say make it safe, right? Make it so it's safe for an investor, right? Be pro capitalism, pro entrepreneurship, or maybe an untapped market where I just did some research on Mexico. Whenever that started to explode, it was like it was the wild, wild west, which means individuals could go down there and kind of roll the land if they had enough money. So it made so much sense to invest. So what would you say?
So it's interesting. So like, and it's really interesting if you start with this point of an element of safety. So it's a really, it's almost the main precondition is going to be, is there peace? Is there stability? Is there some kind of minimal certainty? Of course, you could have a minimal certainty in a context where nothing else is actually in favor of growth. You know, you could have a very, a state that has a more or less a police state that's all controlled. We can't quite do that much. But it's the minimal requirement. In fact, almost, like we as scholars, when we look at the idea of a state, we always say the state is a state exists almost as a solution to a problem of violence, as basically as a provide a framework in which you can operate. Now we have to look at the details of that framework. How is the deal between politics and economics and the military organized in a place? Is it organized to extract as much as possible from everybody? Or is it actually to try to get some kind of playing field, not necessarily totally level, it never is quite totally level, but somehow there's enough clarity, there's a lot of confidence and stability that you can actually say, okay, I can put my money here. And then the main thing is, does it feel like, is there kind of a long horizon? Eh? Because often a government will tell you, oh, come, but actually it's so unclear whether they themselves are thinking beyond the next election or the next government that will be in power. So you kind of have it there. So the peace and stability is important, but it has to be with a longer term focus in mind. Yeah. And what I tell the governments is actually probably the most important thing for the kind of things that I do when I talk to a government is that understand what you can and what you can't do.
Mm.
So everybody gets deeply attracted by either the US, but it took a long time in the US as well to get that all going and the whole capitalism thing. And it needed, we were talking about the New Deal, the 40s and 50s, to be a bit more inclusive as well. It needed these corrections. England as well, it needed its corrections. Often people now these days dream of China or Singapore because it went really fast and it went in a couple of decades. But the main lesson usually is you can't replicate China, you can't replicate Singapore. There you have a very particular context. And for example, the state in China, for 2000 years, it has been a centralized state. For 2000 years, it's having centralized taxation. And by the way, for 2000 years, they were doing, well, in fact, for more than that, people to be working in the public administration had to take a meritocratic exam. So you get a state that is built up very meritocratically, surprisingly, and all focused on delivery. Now, I go in any place elsewhere in the world where the state often has a lot of people that have a job because they knew someone, because they had a friend there, they had some political connection, there's something there. The US has a politicized state, most of Europe has a politicized state. And as a result, these states are not as strong. When I go to Africa and lots of South Asia, these are very much states built up where people got jobs because they had the right party card, the right connections, and whatever. They don't deliver that well. So I tell these governments, be aware of what kind of state you are. Do you look like Korea in terms of the state you have, or Japan, or China, which are these long-term historical states? Or do you look a little bit more like Belgium, where I'm originally from, or somehow on a bad day the US, where it's the state doesn't function that well. And you go to African countries, it's stuff like that. And I tell them, be self-aware. If you can't do it, then actually make space that others can do it for the private sector, actually for civil society. Bangladesh, we haven't really talked much about, but one of the amazing things is that actually they started very much as the state had to do everything. They recognized early on, already in the 1980s, that they couldn't quite do it. And you got in a situation by the early 1990s that 2/3 of the community health workers were actually belonging to one NGO. This is a massive country. This is the largest NGO, non-government organization in the world, BRAC. They were 2/3 of the health workers came from them, all paid for by charitable donations. Now, this is basically the state recognized, look, we want good health services, but we need to step back. And they stepped back. It was not private. It was all still charitable and whatever. But they allowed more or less a state within the state to emerge with these NGOs. They're still incredibly big. They were just self-aware, there's no I can think that the state has to do it, or I wait for the capitalist private sector to build up. No, they said, look, if you want to do it, we'll give you the space. And they did a brilliant job. And it's like amazing things that they step back. So I would tell them, understand what you can't and can do. And if you can't do it, make the space for the private sector, make the space for the civil society, and really make it possible for them to function really well, and support them and encourage them rather than be antagonistic against them or thinking it's nothing to do with us. No, you just work with them. And so Bangladesh has this amazing thing. Civil society, NGOs, they're incredibly strong in all the service delivery, and this is a Muslim country where girls' education is better than boys' education, where girls' health is better than boys' health, where extreme poverty has been reduced by more than half in 3 decades, and so on and so on. And it's a lot to do with finding a way that works for them and finding a way to do it. So it's nothing about ideology, just pragmatism, be self-aware. That's what I tell them, make the space so that the potential you have can be unleashed. And you'll find somehow your recipe, because we know these ingredients are general, but in the end, you need to find someone in your own culture, as you were referring to earlier, within your own history, within your own moment in time, within your own conditions, something that works for you. And then we see that amazing successes in some places, and in other places who just never bother. And these are the places that makes me cross. And then that's for another time. Yeah.
Well, I just interviewed a guy named Jim Rogers. Do you know who Jim Rogers is?
I don't know actually.
He's a Wall Street legend, made millions and millions of dollars in Wall Street, retired at the age of 37, rode his motorcycle around the world, then his car, then he drove his car, and then he was in the Guinness Book of World Records and all. Anyways, I asked him, "Hey, of everything you've done, is there anything you'd go back to your former self and tell that individual to do differently?" And he said, "I would tell my former self to move to Asia faster than I did." He lives in Singapore. He lives in Singapore. He said in the 80s, he knew China was going to be a big, big, big player. And so he's like, I'm going to get out of the United States. I'm going to go to Singapore and I'm going to build a life there. And he says, and the reason why I brought up safety is because he told me he feels so safe in Singapore. He would tell his daughter to get into any taxi and go anywhere in the city. No issues, wouldn't lose sleep about it. You can't do that in the United States. You can't do that in New York City or California. So it made so much sense while I was talking to him and while we were talking just a few minutes ago. Oh, Singapore is growing. It's an insane powerhouse. And the reason why it's probably a powerhouse is because people like him with money who trust that area feel safe being there. And it just makes so much sense. And that's why when I see New York City, who's actually that city is just crushing the American dream, I think, but also it doesn't feel safe. So, how many people are going to invest in that area 20 years from now? What is that place going to look like? It used to be the power plant for creativity, for business, for wealth, and it just seems to be on the decline. And so hopefully your message lands with somebody in politics, because I agree with everything you just said. Um, Outside of your own book, this is a question we ask everyone. Is there a book that you recommend to our audience that would get people to understand whether it's a growth mindset or a development mindset that you'd like to share with us?
Um, well, there's many that I tend to enjoy reading, but look, the one, and I think you featured the author already, I think before. I would still tell people, even though I try to be position my book slightly differently, it's always worth reading something by James Robinson and their own Asimoglu. You know, they have a lot of detailed knowledge, and I hope they don't fully agree with it, but at the same time, I would say you read them. And it's still the case that Why Nations Fail,
Why
which
Nations
takes much
Fail.
more
Yes.
a historical look. And even though I disagree with it, I kind of think, because when I emphasize the agency of people today, and then they emphasize the role of history in it, I usually would say when people say, okay, but where's history and all the things, where's colonialism and all the stuff? And I say, look, I actually have the opinion, if you look at a country, 50% is history, 50% is agency. So I would read these, if you read my book, read them as well. And you can see somehow, they give us the kind of underlying factors of what it needs and what you want to look at in a country. I think I'm trying to get more about whether it's somehow these moments of change and how do you think about it and what have we seen and how can we make it happen there.
Excellent. Guys, his book is on Kindle, hardcover, paperback. And as of last year, it just hit on the audiobook. So you can just have him read it to you. Are you the narrator on the audiobook?
I'm afraid not, no.
Oh, it should be your voice. The energy in your voice is contagious. So it should be your voice, just so you know.
Excellent.
But guys, his book is called Gambling on Development: Why Some Countries Win and Others Lose. And he did bring up a recommendation. I've heard that many times before: Why Nations Fail, and that's by James Robinson. So, Stefan, it's been an honor to talk with you. You match my energy, so it's exciting to talk with somebody who's thrilled with what they write about as much as I am. So, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be your guest. Thank you, Mike.
Is there a website or a social media channel that people can find you on and maybe get in contact? Maybe just LinkedIn. Is that right?
Yeah, there is LinkedIn, but also I'm on Twitter or X at Gambling on Dev. And I'm also have a website, www.gamblingonddevelopment in one word.com.
Excellent.
Gamblingonddevelopment.com. It's
Gambling
easy
on.
enough.
Yeah, that's easy to remember. So check them out, guys. Gambling on Development, the book, it's out there, and 74 reviews. It's hard to get reviews, and so it's resonating with the world. So thank you so much. And remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life.